Well, good. I think we have a quorum, so we can start the meeting. So welcome to Ridge Vineyards Winemaker Roundtable. My name is David Amadia. I'm the president of Ridge, and it's my pleasure to host today's tasting. Today we're going to taste through 4 wines that make up our spring ATP release. And they're 4 fascinating wines, and I'm looking forward to tasting all of them and talking about them with you and our production team. So a few housekeeping points before we get going. If you have a question for the production team, please use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many of those questions live on the Zoom tasting as possible. We also have a few Ridge team members monitoring and answering questions live through the Q&A as well. So we greatly encourage your questions, so please feel free to send those through. Please also feel free to use the chat function to check in. Let us know where you're at, what you're tasting, what you're drinking, and just a nice way to chat and socialize with other people online with the Zoom tasting. So the 4 wines, and hopefully you have all of them poured out, at least 1 or 2 of them poured out in front of you. The order is going to be the 2019 Gonsalves Carignane. The second wine will be the Rockpile Zinfandel Blend. Then we'll do the 2018 Lytton Estate Syrah Grenache Mataro. And then the 4th wine will be the 2016 Lytton Estate Syrah. So a Carignane, a Zin, an SGM, and a Syrah. So it's a nice variety of wines and a nice lineup. So let me introduce our panel. First, David Gates. David's our Senior Vice President of Vineyard Operations, has been with Ridge since 1989. So that's 32 years. He's one of the world's foremost authorities on growing old vine Zinfandel. And he's in charge of all of our estate vineyards as well as all of our outside growers. So he's got a big job and a wealth of knowledge, and happy to have David with us this evening. John Olney. John's our head winemaker. He joined Ridge in 1996, so been with us for 25 years. John is in charge of all winemaking at both the Montebello and the Lytton Springs wineries, which is a huge job, and it's a job he managed to do with a lot of grace. So John, thanks for being with us today. And then finally, my boss, Mark Vernon, our CEO, joined Ridge in 1998, so 23 years. He oversees all of our winemaking and vineyards. He's been instrumental in securing and expanding our estate vineyards at Geyserville and at Montebello. And when he first joined, he was also responsible, or partly responsible anyway, for the construction of our Lytton Springs winery. So he's done a lot of different things since he joined Ridge in 1998. So that's our panel. And why don't we get going with the first wine? And maybe David, since this is a new vineyard, you might want to talk about this site, which is a little bit unusual.
Thanks, David. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, new vineyard for us. We've been in this area before, well into the past, in the 90s. This is kind of a stretch of Contra Costa County that has some beautiful, beautiful old vines. Most of the oldest ones planted in the 1880s on their own roots in pure sand right off the American River, kind of the confluence of the American River and the San Joaquin River, deep in the Delta by Antioch, between Antioch and Oakley, California. So pure sand, very deep sand, or very deep soil. The river influence gives it nice water in the spring, even though they typically don't get maybe 15 or so inches of rain per year, even less in a drought year. But the vines have deep roots and they go down forever, and it's really nice. It's fun as a bit of culturist to see old vines that are own rooted, because they grow differently when you put them on rootstocks. Yeah, this is a great shot of the little bush vines growing. Carignane does beautifully in this area, as does Mataro. There's also Zin and a neat little mission type grape called Rose of Peru that grows there, as well as other grapes. That's Mount Diablo in the distance. And,
is there actually snow on the mountain there, David?
Probably. It was, yeah, either that or ash from the fire. No, I'm just teasing. It's snow. It does get snow every now and then. It got a couple of dustings this year too. The Gonsalves family has been in that area for many years, I believe since the 1930s or so. And over that time, they've been farmers, among other things. And they control a few vineyards now, as well as doing some outside work. Dan Gonsalves, who I worked with to get these grapes, he worked for the water district in Contra Costa County. And there's a huge reservoir in the hills south of there called Los Vaqueros, and he was managing that. So water is always big in this area, and farming is big too. So most of the farms here were by Portuguese immigrants in the 1880s and 90s, and they were kind of feeding San Francisco in growing not only grapes and nut trees and fruit trees, but lots of corn. Brentwood is not far from there. It's kind of a corn capital of Northern California. So it's lots of agriculture, and in the last 30 years, more and more housing. So there's a lot of housing pressure going on. So these old vines are kind of endangered. And, you know, PG&E has a pretty bad rep with all the fires and everything that they've been doing. But in this area in particular, there's a lot of PG&E infrastructure with high towers in the areas, several power plants and transmission lines running through it. Well, those huge transmission lines have very wide easements, and they were grandfathered in 80 or so years ago to be agricultural only, no houses, no anything. So if it wasn't for these huge swaths of PG&E easements, I don't think there'd be much agriculture in this area left at all, especially where the grapes do really well, close by the river where all the sand is.
All right, great. Well, thanks for that, David. That's a great description of a unique site. Now, John, we were excited to work with a new Old Vine Carignane after working with Buchignani for so long. What do you see as the difference between the two sites? And this from maybe a slightly warmer site, do we do anything differently with this wine versus the Buchignani? Oh, John, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Oops, sorry about that. So yeah, it's interesting because Carignane, of course, is a grape that we've worked with quite a bit at Ridge over the years, and we certainly have the longest going track record with the Buchignani Ranch up in Sonoma. But Carignane, of course, it really is such a stalwart when it comes to warm to hot climates. It retains its acidity, has this beautiful focused fruit to it, and really naturally sort of lends itself to a balanced wine. And I think I think you can see it here again. You've got a wine in the Gonsalves which has that brisk acidity to it with that nice focused fruit, and yet I also, for me, whenever I have wines, I find that wines that come out of Contra Costa really do have this sort of signature to them that is easy to pick out, and it's always interesting to just see how the microclimate there really shapes the wine to a certain degree. There's this rustic, very dark fruit quality to Contra Costa County that I always get, and I see it in this wine as well.
Yeah, it definitely tastes like Contra Costa to me, and it would not be easy side by side to look at the Buchignani and this one and see the differences. It would be very stark, I think. Mark, David was talking about sandy soils and own-rooted vines. He didn't really, tie that together and talking about phylloxera and the relationship there. Maybe you want to talk about why these vines are still alive.
Sure. Yeah. And again, it's a little dangerous for me to comment on vineyards with these guys sitting next to me. But the main thing is that the phylloxera is a pest that lives in the ground, and it'll feed on the roots of the grapevines. And if it feeds on them enough, it will severely damage the vine and cause the vine to lose its fruitfulness and potentially even kill the vine. So phylloxera is a real problem historically, and as I think many people realize, because of phylloxera, which was really a pest indigenous, well, found all over the world now potentially, but to circumvent that problem, it was discovered that certain grapevines growing in North America were resistant to that pest. And so today, traditionally for wine grape production, almost all vines are grafted, and they're vinifera on top, which is used to grow the high quality wine grapes that we all know and love, like Cabernet, Chardonnay, Carignan, Zinfandel, etc. And then a rootstock typically taken from a wild native North American lineage, which have then been bred for other various purposes, not just to be resistant to phylloxera, but to also provide different characteristics to match to the type of soil you might be planting your vine in. So if you want to control the amount of growth, green growth and vigor of the vine in a particular type of soil, you would also look to use your rootstock to help you with that. But fundamentally, the beginning of rootstock and grafting was really driven by the need to come up with a solution to the problem with phylloxera. But one thing that kind of stood out as interesting was that vines that were planted in very sandy soil conditions ended up not being impacted by phylloxera like the vines in so many other places. And it really comes down to the fact that the phylloxera itself doesn't like sandy conditions. It's an adverse condition for them, and they just don't do well there, and they don't want to be there. So as a result of that, vines that were planted a long time ago on their own roots and not grafted have managed to survive and not be impacted by it, and to this very day. So it's an interesting characteristic of some of these vineyards in that Contra Costa area, where there is very sandy soil. And Dave, isn't the location of this vineyard near to a little road called Sandy Lane, right? Or not that
Exactly.
far. So
Yes.
we can guess where that road got its name from, right? So anyway.
And is this really the remnants of like the Sacramento River as it sort of changed over the centuries, David? Is that what's left the sand here, or do we know what?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's if you look at the delta as a hole in the map, one thing that you have to kind of think in geologic terms and times, but rivers move, they meander, and it depending on how they move and the amount of current and tide action, they will deposit either sand or clay. So if you go inland a little bit further, you'll find, like say at Brentwood, again, I'll bring that up because there's more clay there, clay and loam. So the river was running a little less fast there, so those finer elements settled out, and where it was dropping sand, that's just probably a little bit faster river action, or more seasonal too, I guess. But yeah, it's all laid down by the river. And there's some sand dunes. There's one not far from this area, closer out by Oakley, on the far side of Oakley, that they estimate there's a 120-year-old vineyard planted on a sand dune that was, who knows how long it had been there, probably several thousand years, maybe tens of thousands of years.
And John, this is kind of an esoteric question, but I was thinking about it was as David was talking about, growing vines that are own rooted. And I've actually met some winemakers who specialize in making wines only from own rooted vineyards. Do you think there's a real difference in terms of grapes grown on own rooted versus not?
Yeah, versus grafted. That is a question which can cause some pretty heated debates. I mean, unfortunately, there are so few wines that are own rooted, especially where they're own rooted, and then you also have the same grape that is grafted to compare the two. So it really is difficult. But I certainly know a number of growers who insist that the own rooted vinifera vines, you know, are more expressive and more the real thing.
Cool. Well, why don't we move to the second wine? And Mark, why don't I ask you to kick off the Rockpile and maybe talk a little bit about how we happened upon this vineyard, because I know that this had to do with a personal relationship of yours, right?
Right. So, yeah. And John and David will talk a little bit more about the Rockpile area, but it's an area that Ridge had, until this particular vineyard and bottling, we had not been making wine from that area, but we had seen a growing interest both by other winemakers and also by customers who were responding positively to wines that were being made from that particular location. So as a result of that, we started thinking maybe it might be interesting for us to make a wine from the Rockpile region. And just about that time, I happened to get a telephone call from a friend of mine who is a medical doctor. He actually has been my wife's allergist for 25 years plus, has a very successful practice in the South Bay area and has, you know, really one of the leading physicians for treating all kinds of allergies. And as a result of that, actually, my wife got to know him very well, and even I did as well, because he's done such a good job for us. And he called me to say, hey, I own a property now up in Rockpile, and there's a vineyard here, and I would be interested in selling Ridge some of the grapes if you would be interested in buying them. So I said, well, I think, yeah, we'd love to take a look. So I got John and I got David, and we went up and took a look at the vineyard, and it looked good. And we thought this would be an interesting place to see how the grapes maybe are similar to or different from the rest of the Dry Creek AVA. So we said to Dr. Biederman, yes, we would like to try this. And what's interesting is, although he was practicing medicine in the South Bay, it turns out he actually was born and grew up in Healdsburg. And he bought this property out of a love of the area and a place for him to come on the weekends and potentially to retire to when he finishes his work as a physician. So that's kind of how we came about it. And as you can see from the pictures right now, once we got up there and started looking at the vineyard, it's pretty easy to fall in love with the site and also see that it was a well-tended vineyard. The vines are healthy and things look good. So with that, I'll let John and David tell us a little bit more about what makes Rockpile unique and interesting as a place to grow grapes.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly I can pitch in on that. I mean, where I would start is in talking about the appellation itself, Rockpile. You know, because California appellations are actually interesting, because I think there's a tendency for us to think that they're the same, that the model sort of in Europe is what was brought over and used in the US. And really in the US, most of the AVAs, or the approved viticulture areas, are defined just by the location, which is usually just a drainage. So, and that's why you see so many appellations in California that are called Dry Creek Valley, Alexander Valley. They're named after valleys because they're really defined just by the overall drainage area. Rockpile is one of the unique appellations in that it is described by elevation. Everything in Rockpile has to be at 800 feet elevation. And you know, there was a small group of growers in Rockpile who, you know, as they planted mostly Zinfandel and were tasting, they really felt that there was something distinct about the Zinfandel that they were growing up at higher altitude than what was happening sort of in the lower area to the east of them in Dry Creek. And so that was sort of how the appellation started. And I think there's definitely some truth to that. I mean, what's interesting, and then David could probably comment on this a little bit, but you know, you sort of think of it as this sort of hillside, growing area. Obviously, there's lots of sunlight, and yet the grapes actually ripen. They take a lot more time to ripen than they do in other places in the area, like Dry Creek and Alexander Valley, where we produce Zinfandel.
And I would say that it's very similar to the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is also an AVA that's defined by elevation in a certain geographic area. And what happens there is that, in my opinion anyway, what happens there is that it's always a little bit warmer at night as compared to Dry Creek proper, but it's cooler during the day. So it's the inversion layer that we talk about, so that's so important to us getting Cabernet ripe at Montebello, and that really helps to moderate the temperatures at Rockpile, so that the grapes will get ripe, but it takes them a little bit longer. But their tannins, it's a different flavor of tannin, a different flavor profile of tannins, and that's because it doesn't get as cool at night. So the enzymes in the vine is still working, still kind of getting ripe as the fruit is getting physiologically ripe even when the sun sets. So because those enzymes can keep working. And also during the day, if it's 100 degrees down at the dam or 105 degrees down at the dam, it's going to be 95 degrees up at Rockpile at the Botticelli vineyard. So that makes a big difference too, because the vines are happier and they can kind of keep chugging along. The bud break is a little bit later up there. Everything gets kind of pushed out later, but it doesn't over ripen the grapes. So it's a neat spot.
I think for me, the Rockpile fruit is a little bit more explosive than Dry Creek. I mean, just the fruit itself is just bam. It just really is in your face. It's really pronounced right away. Where you get a little more dusty fruit in Dry Creek down in the valley and some of those. I mean, for me, the fruit is just super explosive. Can I ask you about the farming a little bit, David, in terms of, this is a trellis vineyard, which is really a little unusual for us in terms of Zinfandel. And, how does that impact how it's farmed, and how does it impact fruit as well in terms of fruit quality?
So it's cordon trained, and it's a high cordon with a set of cross wires. So it's not what we do at Montebello, which is a vertical shoot position trellis. It's not that, which is a good thing because of that intensity of sun that John was talking about. That too much sun is not a good thing on Zinfandel or Petite Syrah. So the canopy kind of comes out and then bushes over. It's supported by those wires, but not held vertically by the wires. And that's very important, because it does, kind of like our head trained vines at Lytton Springs or Geyserville, it kind of creates this little canopy over the vines. Cordon is a little bit easier to farm as far as the kind of nuts and bolts of viticulture. So the pruning is easier, the picking is easier, the spraying is easier, because all the fruit is lined up on one plane in 3D, of course. And so it's easier to get coverage and stuff. And that's why so many, and you can mechanize it if you want to, which they don't at Botticelli, but you can do it more easily, which is why it's such a common form of viticulture in California and worldwide.
Well, David, the fact that it's a hillside vineyard also, I think, does that make using that particular system of training the vines easier to deal with than the
yes.
head prune system, which
it certainly does. The vines are easier to work underneath them, and it's easier to just mow only, which is what they do there at Botticelli, because I mean, it's similar. It's not as many acres as Montebello, but it's just as good a workout when you go to sample that ranch. It's pretty steep. It's it's a good one.
So John, this is our third vintage of Rockpile, the 19. The first was 17, and 3 different vintages in terms of, like, 19, major rainfall, and 17, 18 very different. Do you want to speak to what your experience has been through those 3 vintages at Rockpile?
Yeah, sure. I think what was really interesting, I think with 19 was that in both 17 and 18, I thought the first of all, I thought they were a little riper, and it had some more of that direct impact fruit like you were speaking about. You know, and we had to be a little more careful in terms of extraction, in terms of how we fermented. In 19, and you can see it, you know, in terms of the varietal percentages, we were really able to use a lot of Petite Syrah and without really much danger of it going over the top. I mean, for me, there's this kind of elegance to the 19, which is, you know, you don't see so often in Zinfandel. It's very lacy, and I think really unique in that sense.
Yeah, that is a lot of Petite Syrah, 29% in the blend, John, but it's not overpowering. I mean, it doesn't feel bruised
really well.
at all. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm enjoying that. That's good. Let's move to our third wine, which is the Lytton Estate Syrah Grenache Mataro. And maybe David, I'll ask you to talk about where on the Lytton West this is located and how these vines are grown.
Sure. So this is right in the heart of our Lytton Springs vineyard in Dry Creek Valley, kind of on the eastern edge of Dry Creek Valley. When we bought the property in 1995, it had some Syrah vines on it, and along with a lot of other varieties, most of which we have replaced with Zinfandel, etc. You know, Sangiovese, Barbera, lots of things, Cabernet Sauvignon even. But the Syrah was really good, and so we stayed with that. One thing about Dry Creek is for a straight Syrah, which we'll be tasting next, it's got a little bit of Viognier in it, but a pure Syrah blend, it can be a little monotype. And what we found is, because we do have some old lines of Grenache that came with the ranch as well, the blend of those together really go nicely. And John can speak to what each of the components do, but we found blending them kind of makes this wine. And, you know, that's why these types of wines are so popular throughout the world. Most famously in Oz, you know, Australians make lots of GSMs and everything, but, you know, they've been doing it a long time in the south of France, but they call it by their appellation. So, but they really go well together. And growing them, it's pretty easy. Syrah likes to grow. Grenache and Mataro are both very much they basically originated in the Iberian Peninsula and what's now Spain, and they're used to drought, so they adapt very well to California. Syrah sometimes needs a little help, and we put that on a trellis, a VSP, vertical shoot position trellis, mainly because it's very leggy in its growth, and you can get a lot of wind damage, especially in our springs when it's windy, like it has been a week or so ago. And but the rest of the Mataro and the Grenache, for the most part, is head trained, because they're big clusters and they do really well by that. So yeah, they're fun to grow, and they're pretty, not, I wouldn't say super easy to grow, but they're fun to grow.
Yeah. So like David was talking about, John, you want to talk about the three different varietals and sort of what each brings to the party, and why do we make an SGM instead of a GSM? We had a question too.
Or an MSG.
Well, I think probably starting with the last question first. I think it's mostly a question of just you know, of kind of the availability in terms of what we have planted. I mean, Syrah is usually makes up at least half the blend, so that we sort of start with that, and then we have Grenache and not as much Mataro. And also, I think, you know, even though it is, of course, a blend of three varietals, Syrah, you know, with all of the color that Syrah has, and the way it really jumps out of the glass in terms of aroma, you know, it's a big part of what the wine is about. But, you know, at the same time, you have the other two varietals. You know, you have Grenache, which, you know, Grenache is interesting. Well, David could say, but I think it's it's a grape in warm climates. It's fairly easy to grow, but it seems as if only in certain places does it give that signature of like a rose petal and a cherry kind of fruit. So it also, gives some complexity to the aroma. But then it also adds that little more red fruit instead of just that deep dark black fruit that you get from Syrah. And then Mataro, which is synonymous with Mourvèdre, is, it's a very unique grape. It's of course grown in Spain and in the south of France. But one of the unique things I think about Mataro is that most grape varietals, we sort of identify them sort of in the quality or the type of fruit that they express. That's sort of the first place we go. And that's not really the case with Mataro. Mataro has this, in the south of France, they call it garrigue. Sometimes we call it chaparral here. This like you're sort of running through the grass kind of a thing. It's difficult to describe, but I think it gives it, a little extra complexity, a little note that type. But it's interesting to have them side by side, because I do think there's sort of a good comparison between the Southern Rhone, which would be the Syrah Grenache Mataro style of wine we're talking about here, and then the pure Syrah with that little bit of Viognier, which is all
Rôti.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is an interesting comparison. I was also thinking, John, about oak, right? We talk a lot about oak relative to Montebello and the use of American oak. And we talk a lot about the fact that we use American oak in Zinfandel. We haven't talked a lot about the fact that we use American oak in our own varieties, which is interesting in that, having worked at Penfolds years ago, that, Penfolds uses a lot of American oak with their Shiraz as well. So that's the way they went. But in France, I'm assuming it's mostly French oak that they use in the Rhone. So, what impact do you think does using American oak have on these Rhone varietals?
Well, I think, one of it's interesting if you're making the comparison to France. There's a lot of producers who don't even use any oak.
Okay.
So you have to put them aside. But I think for what I really find, for example, if you're looking at the Syrah Grenache Mataro, I really think there's a combination in terms of the tannins that come out of the American oak and how they combine with the wine, especially with the Grenache, which has those kind of short little aspirin-like tannins. So it's as much, I think, a contribution in terms of mouthfeel as it is in terms of aroma. We tend to, especially with the Syrah Grenache Mataro, we tend to be relatively conservative with the new oak because it's a wine that already has plenty of aroma going on for it. And I don't think you really want to interfere with that. But, obviously there's lots of different approaches.
Yeah, and we have a question actually sort of on point here, John, about American oak, and someone who's surprised by how well it's integrated into our wines and it doesn't poke out, and also asking about how we came to American oak at Ridge in terms of that being our preference. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that history too.
Sure. So, the use of American oak for Ridge really goes back, to the late 60s and certainly early 70s when Paul Draper became the winemaker at Ridge. And one of the things that's difficult sometimes to imagine really is that if you go back, you can just go back to the 60s in California and, raising, putting wine and aging it in barrels as we know barrels, the classic barrel shape of 225 liters. It was actually very uncommon in California. Most wine was aged in large, upright wooden tanks. So, it was at that time in the late 60s and early 70s that people were just starting to experiment with aging wine in smaller cooperage. And again, at the time, France really didn't have any reputation of having superior oak over any other place, because there's plenty of sources. They have oak from Spain, they have oak from France, and obviously we have lots of oak in the U.S. And when Paul started experimenting without having sort of any prejudice one way or the other, he seemed to gravitate more and more towards American oak. And I think one of the, in speaking with Paul, I think one of the reasons also that he ended up, it was easier, I think, for him to go towards American oak because he could work directly with coopers, which of course, he wasn't able to, and it was much more difficult to in Europe. And that was really critical, because the American oak industry really comes out of the bourbon industry. That's why we started making barrels in the U.S. And Paul, I think, was really instrumental in sort of getting the coopers to look at the oak a little more critically, selecting the best oak, air drying it, and really treating it to make fine wine. Yeah. And I think it's because of that the differences, I think, between American oak and French oak, I think, used to be much greater. But I think it was mostly because of the way American oak was being coopered. And today, it's much easier to sort of mistake one for the other.
Right.
And in fact, John, today, some of the finest French coopers have actually gotten into the business of making barrels using American oak, right? So
correct. They've set up shop all over the Midwest.
Right. So now we can source really high quality, well-made barrels with that history of fine wine cooperage from some of the French producers who are making nice barrels with American oak. So it's actually probably the time is really good. Now is a good time. Ridge was fortunate because early on Paul had developed those relationships even with the American coopers to get them to do the things that we felt were necessary to produce the best results. But unfortunately, I think in the early days, a lot of other American oak barrels were being made and sold based on lower price and not necessarily on high quality. So there was some reputational, I think, issues with with the perception of American oak due to that in the earlier days. But certainly now we can obtain barrels that are made just as well with all the right techniques as you would find a French oak barrel. So that, I think, is done. And then I think, John, also the integration and the difference in tannin quality plays an important role between, as you were mentioning, between the American oak and French oak as well. So, and it's always sort of trying to find what matches the best and what fits the best. And I think we've been able to show that these Rhone varietals can do just very nicely with American oak. And keeping it, as John also mentioned, keeping the amount of oak under control. You don't want to go too far. And as John mentioned, there's a number of French producers in the Rhone who don't use any oak. And so I think that's also important. It's especially when you have high quality grapes, you don't need to, sort of use too much oak to compensate for anything. You really want the fruit to shine through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think American oak, and this is a good lesson to anybody in any business, but once you get a bad reputation, it's hard to get rid of it. And American got a really bad reputation in wine in the US because winemakers were using the bourbon barrels, which were heavily charred. And the flavors were great for bourbon, but they weren't really good for red wine. And here we are, 80 years later, still trying to recover from that bad reputation. But yeah, as Mark was saying, if given the right techniques, you can make very high quality barrels here in the United States. And I think the other interesting thing is that what Paul Draper's always talked about was that he's always wanted to make a truly American California product. He never wanted to make an imitation of France. So his ability to use American oak was very pleasing to him, that he didn't have to use French oak. So that's always an interesting aspect. One last question on a winemaking question on this wine, John, before we move to our fourth wine is, with our field blends, we co-ferment, right? With the Zinfandel. Do we do the same thing with these three varietals, or how is this wine put together?
Well, we don't really, but the reason is mostly because they really do ripen so differently. Especially Mataro is a very late ripener, and if we were to wait until the Mataro was ready, we would have certainly Syrah with very elevated sugar, and we'd really be compromising the balance of the Syrah. So it's really a question of, and again, that's one of the really, I think, uncanny things about our field blends is that, again, I always feel like there definitely was a method to the madness in terms of what varietals they chose to put in Zinfandel field blends. And it's because they really do physiologically ripen at about the same point within that field that you're able to successfully co-ferment.
Great, thanks, John. And I guess we can move to the fourth wine, which we can start to talk about co-fermentation again, just to confuse the topic a little more, right? Where this is, like you said, we've gone from Southern Rhone to Northern Rhone, Côte Rôtie, where we have Syrah co-fermented with Viognier. So why don't we start from the winemaking perspective about why in the world would you co-ferment a white grape with Syrah?
Well, Viognier is just, it's a really exotic grape. I mean, the aromas in Viognier are difficult to describe, but certainly very floral. They remind me of lilies, but also this deep honey quality to them. So, anyone who's had Condrieu or a very well-made Viognier has experienced that the wines, pure Viognier wines to me are almost as interesting for the aromatic qualities as they are just for drinking them. And in the Northern Rhone, specifically in Côte Rôtie, which is where Viognier is grown to make a pure Viognier in the form of Condrieu. How they ever began to start putting a little bit of Viognier into their Syrah, I don't know, but they could see the effect fairly quickly, and just a 5% addition of Viognier into your Syrah really, it just combines with all of the exotic aromas you already have going on with Syrah, like bacon fat and pepper, and but I think it just brings it up a whole step. So it's one of those marriages that just seems to work great.
It's a real, traditional. I know you'd probably go back several hundred years, probably when this first started in the Rhone, I would guess, John. But I've also heard that it helps with color extraction. Is that something you've actually found in the tank where you've seen that happen?
I haven't. I'm very familiar with the argument. I've never, I guess a couple things. I've never seen a side-by-side comparison where I said, okay, absolutely. But the other thing too, especially if you're talking about 100% Syrah,
why do you need any more color?
you shouldn't be having problems with color. To be honest, when it comes to Syrah. So, and we certainly never do. Whether it's our Petite Syrah or a Syrah, these are grapes of enormous color. And it's really, I think, the challenge, or I guess what I pay more attention to is your extraction, so that you're not going overboard in terms of what you're pulling out, because there's certainly a lot of tannin in the grape as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great contrast here, the two wines side by side. And I think people forget that Syrah is a noble variety. And boy, when you look at this in the glass right here, side by side with the blend, this is a big, serious wine, right?
Yeah.
And it's just
Yeah.
not messing around here. David, you want to talk about the clone here, because the clone is a bit of a sort of an old California clone, isn't that right? It's a little unusual what we're growing, at least some of the Syrah we're growing at Lytton West.
Yes. One comment though first on the wines. My only knock on these two wines is that they're still so young. Oh my God, the Syrah will be beautiful in another 10 years. I mean, really beautiful. But anyway, yeah, we have a clone that's its name in the industry is called Sra Noir, and it comes from UC Davis, from some importations that were done back in the 70s, 60s and 70s by a Professor Harold Olmo. And one of these Syrahs got kind of put off to the side and didn't really make it when they were developing Foundation Plant Services, which is the clean stock program that for the wine industry. They kind of forgot about this one until they started in the late 70s, early 80s, when the Rhone Rangers kind of came up and everybody was going to do Syrah and Rhone grapes in California, because as we see now, our climate here is ideally suited to lots of different Rhone varieties. Thanks to Tablas Creek, we have lots of different Rhone varieties to work with. But this Sra Noir was kind of brought up, and there's a little bit of there are like 4 different selections of Syrah, and 2 of them are the same, and one of them is the Sra Noir, and it's very similar, or maybe one other vine that's also known as the Phelps Syrah out in the industry, which but you can't find those at FPS anymore. So but we have them. This is the oldest block of Syrah we have, was planted in 1982, before we bought the ranch, and it has we really have liked it as it's matured out, and we've been taking cuttings from that. And we have a separate block of Viognier that's planted in a little bit heavier soil. So in this particular wine, we pick out the Syrah when it's ready, and then we try to get roughly 10% plus or minus Viognier, depending on the year. We'll go in and get that. In some years, like 2016, because of the drought, there wasn't 10% Viognier, so we only ended up with like 7% Viognier in this wine. What we're doing recently, as we replant a few blocks to Syrah, we're actually mixing the AK a la Côte Rôtie. We're mixing the Viognier in amongst the Syrah so we can just pick it.
So David,
where's the Viognier in terms of ripeness versus the Syrah? I mean, are they ripened similarly or differently?
No, the Viognier gets ripe a little bit quicker than the Syrah, which is why in that block of the pure Viognier that we have, it's in a little bit heavier soil. But it's still, if you get your Syrah at 24, the Viognier is going to be 26 and change. So it ripens. It's a little more precocious.
Okay, sorry, Mark, I stepped on you.
No, that's okay. I was just I'm going to ask David. We've planted a little bit more of this Syrah Noir. Is that correct? And where are we with those newer plantings?
Yes, we have. In fact, we have one that's right opposite the block that up on the bench that this wine comes from, and we'll get our first real harvest from it this year, 2021. All things considered.
Yeah.
Last year we had a little bit of it, but it went in with some Petit Syrah that was right next to that block. So we have a little over an acre of that, and that's again mixed with Viognier. Then we have some other selections, mostly the old California selections that we've planted out and are looking at them. Our middle-aged Syrah vines planted in 99, 2001. They are some Untitled selections, and some from Tablas Creek and some directly from direct import from Untitled, which is the French version of Foundation Plant Services. They did a direct import to FPS, and we were able to release that to the industry. and that came with some issues, that a virus that there's an, yeah. So, but that's a whole nother story, and I really don't want to get into it.
Yeah.
Whole nother
So
session.
ironically, not quite as clean a stock as we had hoped it would have been, right, Dave? So.
It's really funny. It's a genetic thing, and it only interacts with certain rootstock, which, as we previously discussed, you have to use in most California soils to protect your vines from phylloxera, but it just makes an incompatibility, which is not uncommon in agriculture, especially with perennial crops. And the problem with this particular virus is it doesn't kill the vine right away. It takes it 5 to 10 years, and so you invest all this money in growing the vines, and then they peter out and die. So
A slow death.
yeah.
David, any idea what the Viognier clone is that we're using?
You know, I do not know. It is one that was brought in again about that same time, 60s and 70s, and that was before Antav was up and running, so they weren't numbering anything. So it came from Côte Rôtie, that's for sure.
Okay.
But we don't know where or anything. It was just from a vineyard in the Marne or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there are some other clones of Viognier, again, directly through Antav, but no, we don't know.
And somebody asked, it was kind of a, I don't know, a blast from the past. Somebody asked if we've ever made a straight Viognier, and we did, and from these vines at Lytton West, and it was a sweet Viognier, if you guys remember, in a half bottle, and it was. And I guess it was just because we had extra, right, David? I mean, it was just additional Viognier we didn't need for the co-fermentation, and we ended up bottling it as a sweet Viognier. And I still have a few bottles of it, and it's like it's a good pâté wine, I would say, right?
Exactly. Maybe foie gras. I don't.
Yeah, no, it's good foie gras wine, and I don't eat foie gras that often, so.
Yeah.
So, John, we had one question. It was more of a generic winemaking question about indigenous yeast versus commercial yeast, and what's the difference, and why we rely on indigenous.
Oh boy. Well, if we have another hour, we could get it. But
it's a big question. Yeah.
It is a big question. I mean, it's a big question. It's a great question. Because it's so it seems fairly simple on the surface, but as you peel it back, it's actually quite complicated. But the biggest difference that I would say, and the main reason that we rely on indigenous yeast is, and maybe to start over on the, so to speak, commercial yeast that you can purchase and put in. The thing about buying one particular yeast, and you have to understand, yeast are actually developed, and specific strains are picked out because they, for example, will enhance the fruit quality. They'll enhance the mouthfeel. So they're usually picked out for maybe one specific factor, and they're extremely efficient at fermentation. You put them in, and what happens is they outcompete all of the naturally present yeast, and they go after, and you get sort of this one quality. But we certainly feel that with indigenous yeast, which relies on a number of different yeasts that sort of, it's like a relay race. They just, one hands the baton off to the next, to the next, to the next, that you really open up a lot more complexity in terms of what you're going to get, in terms of aroma, in terms of flavor, in terms of mouthfeel. So it's, that's the main reason, is that, we feel we get a more complex wine when we just rely on the yeast, which are naturally present.
Yeah. And Mark, maybe you want to expand a little bit on that in terms of, I mean, there's very few wineries of our size anywhere in the world who rely exclusively on indigenous yeast to make their wines. That there people, winemakers are scared off by the concept, right? That they want to turn their tanks, right?
I think there's two reasons. One is that there was a lot of fear, and I think there was a lot of in a sense, education done for modern winemaking that basically said we want to put the winemaker in control of everything.
Right.
And that way, by being in control of everything, you can avoid some of the problems that were more common to winemaking in the past. And problems like a stuck fermentation that doesn't finish with, sugar left in your wine and other issues that could come with that. Or perhaps just a result after fermentation that you weren't looking for. But I think over time, what we came to understand is that a lot of those problems actually weren't because of indigenous yeast per se, but because of other factors. And if you can control for those other factors, you can get rid of those problems without having to sacrifice using the indigenous yeast. And as John said, there's a real advantage we've seen a real advantage to using those indigenous yeast because it is not a monoculture. It's a population of a variety of different yeasts that each contribute something to the finished wine. And there's a great story, I'll tell it quickly, but John himself said one day, I was walking through the tank room and he said, Mark, I want you to come taste these 2 tanks. Or these 3 tanks actually. And I said, oh, what's in these tanks? He says, well, I've put a portion of the same fruit into each of the tanks and I've fermented them with 3 different yeasts. And I said, oh, one tank had all the natural yeast that came in on the grapes. Another tank had a single yeast strain that he had selected from the yeast salesman. And then the third one was a new product that the yeast salesman was pitching John on, which was a combination of several yeasts. And so John had me taste these 3 tanks, and it was very interesting. Without a doubt, the natural yeast fermentation was by far my preference, much more interesting in complex wine. The monoculture yeast was less interesting, less complex. And the new product he was selling of several yeast was closer to the natural yeast fermentation in terms of it was more complex. And so I said, well, John, what did you tell the salesman after you did this experiment? He said, well, yeah, I told him his new product was closer to the natural yeast fermentation, but why would I spend any money buying that from him when I can just have the natural yeast come in at no extra charge and use those to make my wine? So I thought, oh, very clever, very smart. And it really sums up the point that if you can manage your fermentations properly, then you're going to get a great result with the natural yeast. I think sometimes in other situations, if a winemaker is trying to achieve a certain result in terms of perhaps the character or flavor of the wine, then using a specific yeast can be a tool for the winemaker to achieve that. Because Ridge is interested in doing single vineyard winemaking and having the character of the vineyard come through. And in fact, part of that character in our mind is those natural yeasts that are out there living in the vineyard. That's our direction, as opposed to if I have in my mind as the winemaker a specific wine result I'm trying to get that's not necessarily linked to a specific vineyard, then using a specific strain of yeast actually can make a lot of sense, because that can be part of the tools that you take advantage of to craft your wine that you have dreamed of as a winemaker. But I think from the Ridge perspective, because our approach is not to create wines, but rather to guide them from grapes that are coming from really unique locations. And part of the uniqueness of their location is the population of yeasts that are living and become part of that process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe one last super geeky question. So it's perfect for David Gates. So I'm going to put it to you in terms of, have we tracked the genomes of any of the natural yeast in the vineyard? And in our, have we done any ongoing tracking of the different strains that show up on the berries?
So yes, we have, but it was before it was easy to do. So we haven't done much of that lately. But it's neat because what we found was that you would have, as John said, a succession of fermenters, not all yeast, some bacteria too, many of them spoilage. organisms, but after, you know, which sounds like scary, but after maybe a 1% sugar has dropped off and the alcohol comes up a little bit, they all start to die off. They can't take the alcohol. And so only Saccharomyces cerevisiae can really handle that. And it turns out that the strains are different. The dominant strains that finish the fermentation are different from different vineyards, but they all share several characteristics. And I would love to do that now, you know, now that you can just send in a little bit of sample and get anything and everything that ever was in that sample shows up. It's pretty powerful.
I'll tag on to that, because as it turned out that about 15 years ago, when my son was in elementary school, I was on the PTA, and a fellow PTAer who had a child in the same school, actually, she was a researcher at Stanford University. And when I was chatting with her, I was asking her what she was researching. And when she told me she was researching yeast, I said, oh, so I was able to introduce her to Eric, who was the winemaker at the time at Montebello. And she came up and she actually did a fairly, you know, extensive bit of research on the natural yeast at Montebello at that time. But of course, as David meant, you know, running the DNA 15 years ago was a pretty expensive proposition. So she had to, you know, keep writing grants to get enough funding to keep this little project going, and which she did for a couple of years. So she was able to actually, you know, create some of those characterizations that David was talking about. But ultimately, the grant money ran out, and that was the end of it. But now that this kind of, you know, DNA sequencing is so much less expensive and easier to do, it's a project that probably at some point somebody's going to come back and revisit. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank David Gates, John Olney, Mark Vernon for coming and sharing their wisdom with us today. I want to thank the audience for joining us for this hour, and for all the great questions and interactions. This is the last of our spring roundtables, but we do hope to come back in the fall. You'll be the first to know, I promise you. I've seen 3 or 4 chats pop up asking for John Olney to do another cooking demonstration. Well, we'll have to talk to him to see if we can put that in the mix for the fall or not. But anyway, thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good evening. Hopefully you enjoy all these wines over dinner tonight. I know I'm going to. All right, bye for now.
Thanks.